March 1962. The world is paralyzed by a silent, invisible terror. The doomsday clock is ticking relentlessly toward midnight, and the United States is locked in a desperate, suffocating struggle for global supremacy. If you ask anyone who lived through the early 1960s, they will tell you about the dread. They will tell you about the air raid sirens, the fallout shelters, and the constant, gnawing fear that tomorrow might be the day the sky catches fire. We are taught that the greatest threat to American lives during this era came from across the ocean. We are told that the enemy was a sprawling, secretive empire, operating behind the Iron Curtain, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We are led to believe that the men walking the sterile, brightly lit corridors of the Pentagon, the highest-ranking generals in the United States military, were the ultimate guardians of liberty. We assume they spent every waking hour figuring out how to protect their citizens from foreign terror. But what if the history books left out the darkest chapter of the Cold War? What if the most terrifying, apocalyptic threat to the American public in the spring of 1962 was not sitting in Moscow? What if the threat was sitting right inside the Pentagon? Imagine a plot so utterly ruthless, so completely devoid of moral boundaries or human empathy, that it proposed slaughtering innocent civilians in the streets of American cities. Imagine a detailed military-grade blueprint to hijack commercial airliners, to blow up civilian ships, to assassinate leaders, and to stage violent, bloody terrorist attacks in Miami and Washington, D.C. Now, imagine that this plan was not drafted by a rogue terrorist cell. It was drafted, legally approved, and officially signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States Armed Forces. This is not a conspiracy theory born in the dark corners of the internet. This is a declassified, heavily redacted historical fact. This is the chilling reality of Operation Northwoods. To understand how the highest levels of the American military could authorize such an unthinkable, treasonous betrayal, you have to understand the absolute obsession of 1962. You have to look at an island just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Cuba. Fidel Castro had successfully led a communist revolution right in America's backyard. For the Central Intelligence Agency and the top brass of the Pentagon, this was not just a geopolitical problem. It was a massive, unforgivable humiliation. The United States government had already tried to overthrow Castro, and they had failed spectacularly. The disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion had left the CIA embarrassed on the world stage, and it left the military elite burning with a desire for revenge. The generals were desperate for a war. They looked at maps of the Caribbean and saw a problem that could only be solved with fire and steel. They wanted a full-scale military invasion, an overwhelming display of American firepower to wipe the island clean and install a government of their choosing. But there was one massive, insurmountable obstacle. The American public, still weary from the memories of the Second World War and Korea, would never support an unprovoked, aggressive invasion of a small, sovereign nation. The international community and the United Nations would condemn it instantly. The military needed a reason. They needed a casus belli, a justification for war. They needed a spark. They needed a tragedy so horrifying, a loss of life so devastating, that the American public would be blinded by rage and beg their government for retaliation. And if Fidel Castro was not going to give them that tragedy, the generals decided they would simply create it themselves. Deep inside the heavily guarded, restricted access rooms of the Department of Defense, a top-secret document was slowly being born. The men working on this document were not low-level rogue agents. They were the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officers in the United States, men who commanded millions of troops and had access to the nuclear codes. They were led by Chairman General Lyman Lemnitzer, a hardened veteran who believed that the Cold War was a battle for absolute survival, where the ends always justified the means. The title of the document they produced was sterile and bureaucratic, Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. But within the intelligence community, it would become known by its ominous code name, Operation Northwoods. The proposals laid out in these 15 pages are almost impossible to read today. without feeling a cold, sickening knot form in your stomach. It is a playbook of manufactured terror, written with the cold, calculating precision of a military strike. The Joint Chiefs meticulously detailed a campaign to weaponize fear against their own people. The document explicitly states, "We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington." But how do you manufacture a terror campaign? The Pentagon had the answer. They proposed sinking a ship full of Cuban refugees fleeing to Florida, letting innocent people drown in the dark waters of the Atlantic, and broadcasting the tragedy to the world as a ruthless attack by Castro's navy. They suggested planting plastic explosives in strategic locations across American cities. They would detonate these bombs, causing real damage, real panic, and potentially real casualties. Immediately following the blasts, the FBI and local police would conveniently discover planted evidence. Fake radio transmissions would be intercepted. Soviet-made weapons would be found in the wreckage. They would arrest individuals acting as Cuban agents who would confess to the bombings under interrogation. The public outrage would be instantaneous and uncontrollable. But the twisted imagination of the Joint Chiefs did not stop at street-level bombings. They wanted a spectacle, something that would dominate the television screens of every living room in America. They outlined a terrifyingly specific plan known as Operation Dirty Trick. The plan was to charter a civilian passenger plane, perhaps a commercial flight filled with college students heading out on a vacation. The flight would take off from the United States, heading south over the Caribbean. But secretly, at a secure airbase, the military would prepare an exact duplicate of that plane. A drone, completely empty of human passengers, painted with the exact same civilian markings. Once the real passenger plane was safely in the air and out of radar range, it would quietly descend to a secure, classified landing strip, where the passengers would be quickly and quietly evacuated. Simultaneously, the remote-controlled drone would take its place in the sky, picking up the exact flight path. As the drone neared Cuban airspace, the military would transmit a frantic, terrifying distress call on the civilian frequency. The pilot's voice would scream that they were under attack by Cuban MiG fighter jets. And then, using a remote detonation switch, the Pentagon would blow their own drone out of the sky. The wreckage would fall into the ocean, the radio would go dead. The world would be told that Fidel Castro had just slaughtered a plane full of innocent American students in cold blood. The casualties, in the minds of the public, would be completely real. The grieving families crying on national television would be entirely real. The national demand for immediate violent retribution would be deafening. But the enemy they were demanding to fight would be nothing more than a carefully constructed ghost, a phantom created in the sterile rooms of the Pentagon. The military elite believed that the sacrifice of a few innocent Americans, the psychological manipulation of an entire nation, was a completely acceptable price to pay. It was simple mathematics to them. Sacrifice a few to secure the strategic prize of a hemisphere free of communism. They were ready to pull the trigger. The logistics were sound. The operatives were available. The explosive materials were secured. They just needed one final thing. They needed the legal authorization from the Commander-in-Chief. On March 13, 1962, General Lyman Lemnitzer took this terrifying, blood-soaked document, walked into the Oval Office, and presented it to the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We can only imagine the suffocating, heavy silence in that room as the President sat behind the resolute desk, reading the proposal handed to him by his top general. Kennedy was a man already deeply skeptical of the military-industrial complex. He had already been burned by the CIA's horrific mismanagement of the Bay of Pigs, but as his eyes scanned the pages of Operation Northwoods, he realized he was not looking at a flawed military strategy. He was looking at absolute madness. His own generals, the men sworn to protect the Constitution, were actively asking for permission to commit acts of treason, mass murder, and psychological warfare against the American citizens they were meant to serve. Kennedy was horrified by the sheer audacity and the profound evil of the plan. He looked at Lemnitzer and flatly, unequivocally rejected the proposal. He made it abundantly clear that under his administration, There was absolutely no scenario, no justification, where the United States would manufacture a war through domestic terrorism. The meeting was brief, cold, and decisive. Shortly after that chilling encounter, Kennedy systematically began to strip power from the men who had drafted the plan. He removed General Lemnitzer from his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, transferring him to a post in Europe to get him out of Washington. As for the Operation Northwoods document itself, it was immediately classified at the highest possible level of national security. It was quietly locked away in a secure vault, hidden deep within the sprawling archives of the government. For almost 40 years, this terrifying secret gathered dust in the dark. Generations of Americans lived and died, entirely unaware of how close their own government had come to declaring war on its own soil. The public narrative of the Cold War remained intact. The Pentagon was the shield. The Soviets were the sword. It wasn't until the late 1990s, following the end of the Cold War, that the Assassination Records Review Board, using the Freedom of Information Act, finally dragged the Northwoods documents out of the shadows and into the harsh light of day. When the files were declassified and published by independent journalists, the revelation sent absolute shockwaves through the historical community. It was a paradigm shift. It shattered the carefully maintained illusion of the benevolent protector. It proved, with undeniable black and white government-stamped evidence, that the institutions designed to safeguard a nation are perfectly capable of destroying it if they convince themselves that the end justifies the means. Operation Northwoods was never executed. The bombs never went off in Miami. The fake distress calls were never made. But the simple fact that it was conceived, the fact that it was drafted, debated, and officially approved by the most powerful military minds in the country, leaves us with a deeply unsettling reality that we still grapple with today. We sleep safely in our beds at night, locking our doors, believing that the monsters are always outside the gates. We watch the skies for foreign threats. We build massive defense networks, and we trust the chain of command. But the declassified pages of Operation Northwoods force us to ask a terrifying question, a question that echoes long after the Cold War has ended. What happens when the monsters are the ones guarding the walls? If you are fascinated by the terrifying truths that hide in the blind spots of history, if you want to know what else is buried in the classified archives, do yourself a favor, hit subscribe and join the family. I'm your host, and you're watching Decoding Myths. Remember, the truth never really disappears. It just sits in the shadows, waiting to be dragged out.